I'm Deborah Lupton from the University of New South Wales. Oh, there's Simone. Hi, Simone. I'm seeing all these familiar faces popping up. It's great to see, and people I know and people I don't know joining in. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Sorry, Deborah Lupton from University of New South Wales, leader of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society's Health Focus Area, and also leader of the UNSW node, and also co-leader of the People Program of the Centre of Excellence. And the People Program is very much about mostly qualitative, ethnographic approaches and innovative approaches, qualitative approaches to understanding people's engagements with and understandings and practices and feelings and thoughts related to emerging technologies, such as automated decision-making, but not only automated decision-making, because ADM takes place within a much broader ecological context of other digital technologies and non-digital material dimensions. I'd like to begin with acknowledging that the University of New South Wales campus that I work at, although I'm not physically there right now, is on the lands of the Bedegal and Gadigal people and the Eora Nation in that region of Sydney. And of course, those lands were never ceded. And we are the settler colonialists on working on those lands, and I'd really like to acknowledge and respect the elders from those tribal groups on our lands of UNSW, and to acknowledge the elders who are current and emerging and past. And as I said, I'd like to welcome everyone else today, our presenters, everyone who is taking part. This workshop was really inspired by, I guess, a continuing debate we're having in the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. I'm just going to say ADM and Society from now on because it is a mouthful. That automated decision making itself and other emerging technologies such as AI.
Sorry, just on another call.
Oh, could I just I just remind everyone to put themselves on mute. Thank you. That these are quite mysterious terms that even those of us within the centre are debating. You know, what does it mean? What does automated decision making even mean? And, you know, there's quite a debate in the academic literature about how we even define what it is we're focusing on, let alone what's happening out in the outside world beyond the ivory tower in terms of how the average person, if you were to say, you know, if you go down the street, if you were allowed to right now, and bump into someone at a supermarket and say, oh, by the way, I'm working, you know, on automated decision making, it'd be interesting to know, I think, what an average person would respond to that, and if you were to ask them what they think they mean by that, what they might reply. So that really is what we're really interested in identifying in the People Program of the Centre of Excellence. And, you know, I recently published a discussion paper which I was quite interested in how the Australian news reporting had talked about ADM, because it seemed to me that there wasn't even a lot of public discussion in the news media using that term, automated decision making. So I did a quick and dirty analysis using Factiva and published a little discussion paper on that, which you can find online, open access if you're interested. But what I did find, which I actually did suspect, was that ADM hasn't been used very much in the Australian news, online news reporting, compared to, say, AI or even other terms that we use often in the literature, machine learning and things like that. ADM just doesn't really get much of coverage. So why would we expect the average person in the Australian community to even know about it or have any opinion on it? But in the People Program, that is really what we're interested in. So I thought I would ask some really interesting presenters who I knew are doing interesting work on just how to elicit people's understandings and practices and feelings. I'm very interested in feelings as well, the affective dimensions of emerging technologies. And so that's what we're doing today in this workshop, this half-day workshop, which was meant to be based in Sydney as well as being hybrid, but now it's fully online, of course, for obvious reasons. There is a follow-up workshop that was going to be based in Melbourne a week from now, next Tuesday morning as well, that has Melbourne-based people, both within the Centre of Excellence and outside the Centre of Excellence, who will be presenting. So I really encourage people to also attend that if you're interested. But I'd like to get going now. I should just mention that one of our presenters this morning, Claire Southerton, who works with me in the Vitalities Lab, unfortunately is not feeling well today. So she unfortunately won't be able to give her talk today. So we'll just basically just move on. She was going to be the third speaker. We'll just move straight on to Ash and Vaughan's talk from the talk that I and Ash are going to be giving. But I would like to begin I also say that please, for those of you in the audience or listening in or other presenters, if you do have any questions, do put it in the chat function and we'll get back to them. We have 15 minutes for each presenter to speak. We have 5 minutes of questions. So please do add your questions as you think of them. I'm going to try and be fairly careful with time. I've got my fabulous technology here with the timer on it that I'm going to use. And hopefully it'll make a very loud noise when we get to 14 minutes for everyone, for all the presenters. Hopefully you'll hear that, or maybe for Jackie, just go like that, because it is hard to keep time online. So anyway, we'll see how we go with that. So I'm going to start the timer very soon, but first I'm going to introduce Jackie Lee Scully, who is our first presenter, and she of course is working with us at the UNSW United, the Centre of Excellence. She's also the Director of the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW. And Jackie, please start now. We've got 14-minute warning, then 1 minute to follow to finish up, and then 5 minutes questioning time, and your time starts now. Thank you, Jackie.
Okay, I should be on show now. Can you see my screen?
I can.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Yeah, Deborah, you're just going to have to wave your hands dramatically when the time comes. I'll do my best to keep to time. I'm, as Deborah said, first off the cab rank this morning, which is always difficult, but I want to talk to you a little bit about a particular method that I've been using for some years now called, which we call dialogue groups, and which in the past myself and other people that I've worked with have found useful in trying to dig a little bit more deeply into people's reasonings and values and principles around technology. So I'm hoping that this will prove useful to me in the Centre of Excellence, but also perhaps interesting to other people. By trade, I'm an empirical bioethicist, so I try to get a sense of what's going on out there in the real world in terms of people's ethical and moral evaluations and behaviour with new technologies. I'm interested in things like what kinds of moral reasoning do different groups of people use when they're faced with a novel and unprecedented technology where they can't really draw on past experience very readily to try to decide, you know, very basic questions like, is this a good thing to use? Is this an appropriate thing for me to use? Should society ban it? Those sorts of questions. I'm interested in the kinds of moral reasoning, the sorts of moral values and principles that people, different individuals, but also different groups who have different perspectives, draw on, what kind of contextual features they take into account when they're trying to make those evaluations, and are they aware of where these frameworks come from, and if so, you know, where do they come from? Are they community tradition? Are they individual reasoning, and so on? And in part, I'm interested in this for its own sake, but also because it can be used, I believe, to inform normative ethics and ultimately feed into public policy and regulation. And I hope that'll become a little bit clearer as I go on. Dialogue groups arose out of a particular problem that faced me now some years ago when I was involved in a Wellcome Trust funded project in the United Kingdom. This was back in the sort of 2002 period, and it was one of the first fully funded projects that were trying to look at what we would call non-professional or lay moral evaluations, in this case of what we were then calling, you know, the new genetics, less new now, obviously. We aimed to try to find out how non-professional lay participants decided whether prenatal sex selection for social, that's for not for medical reasons, but for reasons like I want to have a little boy versus I want to have a little girl, how they decided whether that was a good thing or not, irrespective of whether it's good for them or not, whether it's something that they would have done or indeed have experienced. And at the time, as now, prenatal sex selection for social reasons was not legal in the United Kingdom. And fundamentally, I wasn't really interested in whether people thought that this was morally permissible or not, but why they thought that and how they came to have that opinion. And the issue we were faced with was, how best to address this. We wanted to use a qualitative approach, and the obvious options that were up for grabs were standard qualitative, structured or semi-structured interviews, the use of focus groups, and various kinds of deliberative methods. And in the rest of this talk, I'm going to speak of deliberative methods in a very loose fashion, and I know that Stacey and Eve and a couple of other people will probably tear me to shreds for doing that in due course. The problem was we ran into several problems with this, methodological issues. One of the first was that the majority of people don't have the tools, the language, the concepts with which they can easily articulate their moral views or their rationales or their reasons. That's not to say that they don't have them, but it's not easy for them to unearth them and put them into words. And in fact, what we found was that when people could articulate those relatively easily, they tended to be drawing on ready formed frameworks that were not necessarily ones that they fully endorsed themselves. In addition to that, if we did interviews, we found that what I'm calling the abstract interviews, that is, if we presented an abstract issue to a person, like, what do you think of prenatal sex selection for social reasons? It was not very revealing. People were unable to say very much. On the other hand, if we tried to do interviews with people who had faced that problem in their own lives, they found it quite challenging, and often it was extremely difficult for both interviewer and interviewee to talk about the morality and the ethics behind something so personal. We did look at focus groups, which were less challenging because they're more diffuse, but then found that the discussion and the methods that we were offered there were generally fairly superficial, and the issue that was being addressed was not terribly complex. We did go and look at various public deliberation methods because we thought this was actually a good way of bringing together representative groups, and I'm not going to go into detail about what you might mean by that, to discuss something, equip them to discuss that issue with some kind of information, and give them also an opportunity for themselves to learn and form their own views. The main problem we found with standard deliberative methods that were available were that there's an expectation that you will reach some kind of useful consensus, because they come from deliberative democratic traditions. And so the discussion was constrained by, in a sense, the expectation that you will funnel down into some sort of consensus that you can then articulate externally. There's also, and we can discuss this later on, a sense in which the kind of information, the level of information that was necessary to provide for those sorts of exercises tended to overwhelm the kind of participants we were working with, and they ended up feeling more disempowered and less able to discuss because of that level of information. More fundamentally, on the whole, standard deliberative methods are used in projects that are either initiated or controlled by state actors, and the aim is not necessarily an exploratory or probing one, but very often, not always, but often, a strategic one just to increase the legitimacy of a particular policy. The sorts of protocols that were available tended not to dig deeper into those issues that we were really interested in, but to focus instead on simplification and clarification, which wasn't necessarily going to give us an answer to our kind of questions. So eventually we landed on a modification of standard focus groups, which aimed to just try to help the participants come to an articulation and a justification of their moral positions. There wasn't a requirement to reach consensus. It's a collective process, so it's a little bit less threatening, particularly around ethical and moral issues, which can really make people feel put in the spotlight. with a facilitator to ensure that what's going on is polite and reasoned and shared discussion. We ideally went for somewhere between 4 and 8 participants with a facilitator. The groups lasted for anything from an hour to 2 hours, depending on a number of factors. One important thing we found was to give a real minimum of factual information so that people were informed enough to discuss, but not perhaps as fully informed as they would be in a deliberative method. I'll come back to one reason for that later on. We would start by presenting people with fictional vignettes that involved some kind of decision. So in this case, it would be a vignette about a couple who were contemplating whether to use sex selection methods for prenatally for social reasons. And then we'd launch into an exploration of questions like, what do you think they should do, rather than what do you think is right? And then followed that up with a sort of what you could almost describe as a Socratic dialogue sort of process of just probing further into the responses that came out with, why do you feel that? What is your gut feeling about it if they couldn't actually say something at the beginning? Where do you think that's coming from? What sort of things are coming into your mind when you're thinking about that? We found it important to keep the vignettes relatively sketchy. Participants sometimes found this frustrating, but the key thing there was that it highlighted the epistemic gaps, not just gaps in what they needed to know, but what they needed to know in order to make their decision, because that was indirectly revealing of what they found was important. Why do you need to know whether they already have children before this decision? You can then systematically modify those vignettes to explore different factors that might be influencing them. So does it make any difference if they already have 5 boys, or does it make any difference if they come from a different cultural community? We found it very useful because we could start with an abstract sort of story and then move to more, you could then ask questions like, well, what would you do, to make it very personal? But you could also move towards more abstract considerations like, do you think everybody should do this? Or do you think this should be part of general healthcare policy? And if not, why not? And so on. Practically, we audio recorded them, had them transcribed, and then used an interpretative analysis. And it had to be interpretative because very rarely did people say explicitly what it was what was their fundamental ethical framework that they were using, or what moral values they were drawing on. In 20 years-ish of doing this, I think I've come across 2 people who actually said, well, speaking from a utilitarian point of view, and used any kind of the vocabulary that we would be used to as ethicists. So we found that this approach enabled us, first of all, to say something substantive about participants' opinions, that they, what proportion it was roughly who were in favour of social sex selection or not. It could also reveal some of the complexities that might be missed in more consensus-focused, and certainly would be missed in more, I think, quantitative approaches. So that, for example, quite a few people said it was okay to want a child of a defined sex, but it was not okay to do anything effective about it, which was quite an interesting exploration of the expectations around technology. And it also gave a theoretical insight into how people did this stuff together in working on ethical challenges. So we watched people pushing past their initial gut feeling, trying to find relevant distinctions, what kind of information they needed, what kind of parallels or analogies they would draw on, whether they would look to adoption, whether they would look to other kinds of choice around childbearing. As I said, the ethical principles or values are very rarely named explicitly, so there's a significant amount of interpretation going on there. And I'm aware, of course, of the issues that arise there about the limits to interpretation and the dangers of, quotes, reading too much into things. That analysis also helped us to identify forms of reasoning which would not normally be very apparent, particularly not the propositional. And I'm emphasising that because in standard normative bioethics, other kinds of reasoning other than propositional tended to be ruled out. And this was problematic because, for example, very often people in that particular study would use metaphors, and this is quite common, I found, in other projects. The metaphor that came up a lot in that study in ordinary ethics was a child is a gift, not a commodity. And when we described that to other bioethicists and policymakers, they tended to be very dismissive of that, saying, well, it's not reasoning, it's not grounded in any kind of rational thinking, it's an incoherent metaphor, because if a child is a gift, who is the giver, etc., etc. But I think what we found in context, is that really my 5-minute warning? Okay, what we found in context was that this pointed to a kind of underlying moral value about giving up control in parenting, and that is the kind of thing that you can turn into language that bioethicists and policymakers will take seriously. So in that project, we were, for example, able to talk about people's concepts of the ontology of a child, what gender roles were, what are the behaviours of morally good parents, what is the fundamental nature of parenthood, concepts of chance, choice and control. And we came to those by examining what was underpinning their expressed views on the regulation of reproduction, limits to medical intervention in society, limits to state intervention in private lives, how to balance collective responsibility and personal desires. So I'm hoping that that kind of empirical exploration of public moral frameworks will also be useful in looking at the views that inform ADM, even if people are not familiar with it, with that technology, to give input into a bioethicist's normative reflection, but also for the social science studies of science and technology, for the substantive content of what people think about that socio-ethical landscape, into policy, not by virtue of providing a straightforward recommendation, but by helping to uncover the shared values and principles that on which policy could be designed, and I think importantly to find common ground between polarized views which often arise, and in general in terms of citizenship, to use the method to inform public discourse around a very unfamiliar technology. Just a few acknowledgements there, and thanks for the colleagues who worked with me on that original Ordinary Ethics project way back, and to colleagues also from Newcastle in the UK, Basel in Switzerland, and Sydney and Wollongong from here. I think it's been 7 subsequent projects using dialogue groups, and of course to all the participants in those projects too. So I'll now try to stop slide sharing.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jackie. Now, I can't see any questions in the chat. And now I'll have to, so if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. And I'm going to just try and see if here's Mark. Mark Sanderson. Yes, please.
Hi. Thank you so much for that talk. And let me just flag, first of all, I'm a computer scientist, so I know nothing. But really, I've absolutely adored listening to this discussion of methodologies, because that's just not something that we in computer science really have very much of an idea of. How do you know at the end of these inquiries from people, how do you know whether what you're capturing is correct? Or how does one deal with that sort of question?
When correct in what sense?
Of value, I suppose. I mean, I suppose what you're trying to do is to capture some sense about what a group of people think, and then how do you know that the thing you've captured is then valuable to society or things like that?
General. The question of, I suppose, generalizability, and that's a really fundamental question in any kind of qualitative research. Very practically in those sorts of projects, obviously we run more than one dialogue group, and you reach a point where similar things are coming up, sometimes the same things coming up. And I tend to say to students, you know, when you start getting really bored with with what you're coming up with, because you can see the same things over and over again, that's what you call theoretical saturation. You can do, there are various methods in which you can try to assess, you know, validity, reliability, and so on. I think there's a sense that if people are thinking it, then it has a valid contribution to make to a debate or discussion, or just to enlarge our repertoire of ways in which we can think, or that we think other people think about this issue.
And do these methodologies ever get sort of evaluated longer term? Like, if these methodologies inform laws or inform policies, does anyone then say, you know, did those policies, you know, did policies from this methodology turn out to be more successful than policies from this methodology, or is it just too difficult to do that?
I'm not aware particularly of this methodology, of that kind of evaluation being done, and certainly nobody's ever come to me and said, hey Jackie, those dialogue groups, they were really, really useful and we put them in here. But I think that you can see over time, in whatever issue it is, whether it's sex selection or genome editing, which is something else I've worked in, maybe also in ADM, a shift in the way that policymakers may think about, talk about, write about a particular issue. And certainly I've seen over that time, not that it happened fast, you know, I've been doing this for a while, the philosophers philosophically inclined bioethicists can be a good deal less dismissive of the kind of material that's coming up out of the public discourse than they used to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for the response. Jackie, we will have to move on, unfortunately. I'm just, so I'm actually the next presenter with Ash Watson, and I'm just uploading my presentation, but thank you. That was really interesting. Now, can everyone see my presentation?
Yeah. Yes.
Good. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to try and time myself. I'm going to introduce myself. Now, I'm going to start off with just basically talking about our method, and Ash is going to jump in right at the end to talk about how we actually, what her experience was of running our approach that I'm going to describe. So everyone, well, I'll just reintroduce myself, but I also introduce Ash from the UNSW node and the health focus area of the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. Ash is working with me as one of the postdoctoral researchers in our projects for ADM and health. And but Ash was also working with me on an ARC discovery project before she was employed on the Centre of Excellence projects. So we're actually going to be talking about the discovery project that we worked on previously, and we're still writing things from. So the project is called Living with Personal Data, and we are doing various methods that we were using in this project that we suddenly actually had to, we just started our field work, and then the first national lockdown erupted in March last year, so we had to very quickly change things to online only. So we've done video ethnographies with 40 home visits to people living in Sydney, which started off with a few of them actually us physically being there, but then became online using basically Zoom and other apps to get people to do their ethnography, home visit, walking around the house showing us while we were on the other end. But what we're going to be talking, and also there were hand-drawn mapping approaches that we did in those video ethnographies of home visits, but what we're going to be focusing on today is the creative writing prompts that we used on the second part of this project using 8 online workshops. Again, we had planned to do in-person workshops but weren't able to because of COVID. And I'm just going to describe our methods, and we're in the process really of writing analyses based on the methods that we use, but I'm just really going to talk about the approach we used today as a sort of introduction to how we did things. So just in terms of sort of conceptual background to this research, the idea is that we're interested in people's understandings and practices and also their effective responses to not only the personal digital data that are generated with and through and by their interactions with online devices and mobile devices and apps, but we're using this conceptual approach that takes this more than human approach to understanding humans as coming together with other things, which include non-digital things, but also digital devices and software in the form of code and applications as they're moving through time and space, and more often than not, generating data with and through these online encounters and interactions on apps, including social media, of course. So our key research questions are underlying this project are how do humans make and remake their personal digital data, and how do these digital data make and remake humans? So very much this sort of back and forth interactions that people have in terms of subjectivity, embodiment, social relations with and through the digital data that are generated with their encounters online and with apps and mobile devices. And we also take a more than representational approach. So what that means is we're interested in the multi-sensory engagements that people have with all dimensions of their sensory, their embodied sensory encounters with devices and with their digital data, with the affective dimensions of those encounters, the more than human dimensions and the more than digital. So we're interested in, for example, when we went to do home visits with people, we were interested in the other technologies that were in their house, the furniture, the more than human encounters they had, not only with the humans living in their space, if they were sharing their home spaces, but also with animal companions that might be sharing their space, with non-digital dimensions of those spaces, such as furniture and how they arrange their digital devices with their furniture, particularly, of course, once they had to start to learn and work from home, as many people did during the first national lockdown and in following lockdowns after that time. So that really this idea as to the multisensory affective dimensions, the more than digital, more than human relationships, this really fed into how we developed our methods for these online workshops. And so I'm not going to go through all of this. There's a lot of information in this slide, but basically we held 8 online workshops and they were about an hour in length. We held them on Zoom. And of course, the wonderful thing of doing remote methods is you can get people to engage from all over the place. And in terms of our large continent, meant we could do workshops with people living in rural, remote, regional areas, as well as, if we wanted to, all the different states and territories of Australia. So that is actually a really fabulous positive dimension of going online. And we had 59 participants in the 8 online workshops, and we used a different method in each workshop because we wanted to experiment with the probes, with the cultural writing probes in each one. But we did start with the same icebreaker in each workshop, and so that one was where we began with a brainstorming activity, and participants were given 1 minute to write notes, and then 10 to 15 minutes to discuss how they understood and defined data and personal data. So we did ask people to do some writing. All the activities were very much pen and paper, and then people shared with the rest of the group their thoughts and their creations, their artifacts that they've generated with these activities. So the first workshop used the idea of data letters, and this is the only method that we actually drew from someone else's idea. We've got this from the book Universal Principles of Design. All the other workshop prompts basically were ones that I developed that I wanted to experiment with, but this one was from that book, and it was write a love letter or breakup letter to your personal data. Workshop 2. We asked people to imagine that a stranger enters your name into Google search to see what information about you comes up. Write a description of you based on what you think that stranger could find out about you, and what important details about you does this data profile not reveal, because we're also interested in what the internet doesn't know about you as well as what it does know about you. Workshop 3, data mementos. Think about new ways that your digitised personal information or memories that you would like to keep into the future could be recorded and stored. Draw your ideas or write them down. So some of these prompts were about future imaginaries that we're interested in people as well as their present experiences. And as you can see there, I actually have included an example of the artefacts generated in the workshops for each of these slides as well. So you get some sense of the kinds of creations that people generated. Workshop 4, faces everywhere. Imagine a near future in which smart objects and smart environments constantly scan your face using facial recognition software. What are these smart things? How would this technology make your life easier or make your life harder? Workshop 5, invent your own app. Draw and write a description of a new app for your mobile device that would generate information about you that would be useful to you, and then various prompts that we asked people to engage with as they were doing that. I'm going through these very quickly, I know, because we don't have a lot of time, but we are recording this session, so if anyone's interested in going back and looking at what we're doing and what everyone else in this session is doing, in this workshop is doing, then please do have a look at the recordings when they're put up later. Workshop 6, data afterlives. Write a story imagining what happens to your data after you die. What kind of data would you like to preserve for future generations to view or use? What data do you want to see destroyed or lost? What kind of life will your data persona have? Workshop 7, being an algorithm, was getting people to imagine about, from the perspective of an algorithm, think about 3 ways in which personal data were generated about you in the past week, digital or non-digital, and then basically think through those ideas to produce a data profile about yourself if you were an algorithm generating data profiles and what it reveals about you. And finally, workshop 8, interviewing objects and life histories of an object, a smart object. Write a story from the perspective of a smart object you have chosen. We gave some examples there. So we've got about 6.5 minutes. Ash, if you would like to jump on and just give some reflections. Ash was the person who did run the workshops. So yes, if you could just spend that remaining time just reflecting a bit on how they worked and what you found was beneficial or useful and what maybe was difficult about the method.
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone. Yeah, so I run these workshops. I suppose the first thing that I thought of actually listening to your talk, Jackie, was about the first part of the workshops that we did, which was the brainstorming activity. So this was the same in each workshop, and participants knew that they had to come with a pen and paper and to try and dive into writing as quickly as possible. I gave people 1 timed minute to jot down as many things as they possibly could that came to mind when they thought of the terms data and personal data. And this connects to Jackie's point on the kind of constraints of expecting or kind of setting up a research session to produce a useful consensus. I very much stressed with this, even though the prompt was about kind of how do you define data and personal data. I definitely stressed that what I was after actually were the impressions. So everything that came to mind, which rather than giving people, I think, a longer few minutes to come up with a definition, only giving people 1 minute was useful for eliciting those very immediate impressions. So the different kinds of things that came to mind for people were all the different kinds of data that they could imagine, the different devices that they had that generated it, the actions or practices that generated data, as well as the uses of that information and how that information could be represented either back to themselves or, for instance, within a data analytics company. And that was really useful because I think it gave us some tangible things to connect to go into the more creative activity. So nobody resisted doing the creative activity. They knew that they'd have to do some kind of activity, but we didn't let people know what it was in advance. So they didn't know that they'd have to kind of imagine something or, you know, tell a story about something. We didn't give that much detail, but having that opening discussion where they'd already done a bit of writing and everybody in the group had shared those immediate impressions and nobody kind of had a definition that was more useful or less useful than somebody else's. Yeah, it gave us some nice things to hook onto in terms of specific devices, specific practices, specific kinds of data to talk about. So the activity time in each session was quite elastic. I tried to stick to the same schedule for each of them, but I mean, it's anybody that's, you know, done group stuff knows that it kind of depends on the group as how that goes. So I tried to get the first brainstorming and introductory activity done with around the 20-minute mark. Sometimes this blew out a bit longer if the group had kind of a lot of things and immediate impressions that they really wanted to dive into that kind of connected to everyday life frustrations. But for most people, for most groups, we started the activities around the 20 to 30-minute mark into the hour. So when I gave the prompt, I read it out verbally. I kind of explained what I meant a little bit more, and also always posted it into the chat so people could refer back to it over the 10 minutes that they had to complete the activity. I think that was useful. I'll talk through some of the different activities and what I think that they really helped elicit.
How's the internet, Danny?
Oh, sorry, somebody's just not on.
Oh, sorry.
Mute. Oh, that's okay. No worries. So the love letter was the first one that we did, which I really liked, because it was, I think it was Valentine's Day that we did it, so it was a nice time to do it. And rather than kind of really impassioned love or breakup letters, most of the group actually wrote kind of a very mixed emotions letter, and they worked themselves towards either a love or a breakup kind of conclusion. That's something that it helped us get to, were the mixed feelings people had about personal data processing and how different feelings were linked to one another. The data profile one was an interesting one. I did that with a group of teenagers, and they all knew, because the setup of the prompt was kind of, if somebody Googled you, what would they know? And everybody knew, because they were all like, well, we actually Google ourselves. We do know what these things are. So that, you know, that was kind of an interesting one with that group to, I don't know how they then kind of framed that knowing and that as a practice that they were kind of used to engaging in. The Faces Everywhere activity was probably one of the more speculative activities, because it asked people specifically to imagine a future world where facial recognition technology could be anywhere that they imagined, and what did that world look like. I think something really useful that came up out of that activity was it kind of opened up people's imaginaries of access in particular. So what hands-free technology could allow in a world, in terms of surveillance, but also in terms of accessibility. The Data Afterlives activity was really interesting, because something that it opened up that I've been thinking about at the moment in doing some writing is that the data that people found useful in their everyday lives was not the same data that they'd want to be passed on to their families. So things that kind of facilitated, I don't know, like personal data tracking in different ways, shopping rewards, health rewards, that's not the data that they wanted to be passed on to their families. And
1 minute, Ash. Sorry, 1 minute.
Great. I'll talk about the last one that I wanted to then. So the algorithm activity, where people had to imagine from 3 different kinds of personal data that they generated in a typical week, what kind of would an algorithm present to them on a different app. Say, for example, a TikTok, what would come up in your algorithm, or what ads would come up on a social media site. And what this really showed is what people understand about complex sets of data. So not individual personal data points or individual apps that they might use to do self-tracking of some kind, but what the combination of those things as revealing, and what they can reveal about a person. And from that, what kind of feelings of insecurity or privacy concerns that young people in particular in this group brought up. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks Ash. Thanks very much. So Tal's got a question in the chat function. Thanks everyone for the excellent talks. I have a question about recruitment. Did you target specific audiences, example stakeholders, and if you were going for a general public, how did you find diverse participants? Well, Tal, our secret sources that we use for this example, and previous research too, I've used them, is a market research company who has panels of volunteers, many of them, that will fit just about every demographic you want. So we work with them, and we gave them sub-quotas. We told them we wanted a very heterogeneous, because we were actually very interested in heterogeneous groups. We gave them certain age groups that we wanted to make sure that we did go across different age groups, So that was the secret to our recruitment. But I have used Facebook recruitment very successfully as well to get a diverse range of participants. Did you want to say anything more? Is there anything you want to follow up with that, Tao?
No, that's great. I just, because in the transport mobilities, we're hoping to also run creative workshops, and I love all these prompts. But yeah, always sort of faced with the question of how to find people just beyond your immediate circles, or to break through, you know, past sort of our particular sort of socioeconomic group, which I often find with doing workshops that we, you know, just by virtue of who we're recruiting, we often sort of recruit people like us, and I'm trying to find people not like us.
Well, I mean, Facebook is a really cheap way of doing it, I've got to say. So we, you know, market research companies, you do have to pay a fair amount for them to do the work, obviously. But yeah, I found Facebook works really well, and as we know, you know, 60% of Australians of all ages are very keen Facebook users. It may not be the best way to get the teenagers, but because they don't use Facebook, but we found it was really easy to recruit through just doing a Facebook ad. So that's just another idea.
Oh, okay. Do you use so you pay for the Facebook ads? Do you no, maybe I'll follow up with you personally about this later.
Okay, sure. We've got time for one more question, I think, if anyone has another question for myself and Ash. Anthony, did people have views about government data versus data generated by private companies? Anthony, thanks for the question. We're only just going through the materials and analysing the materials, but Ash might, given Ash ran the workshop, she'll be able to obviously remember what people said. Ash, do you have an answer for Anthony?
Yes, people certainly did have opinions. I haven't been able to kind of determine any good pattern of that. Some people were fine about private companies because they don't trust the government, so they thought government data was much less secure. For various reasons, kind of their political affinities too. They think the government does things much more on the cheap than private companies. So they think that, you know, therefore that their infrastructure is just not quite as good. Some people didn't like privately collected data because they think that there's always a kind of cost bottom line involved in whatever they're doing, even if it's kind of social data for good. Yeah, so it definitely ranged. I think most people were ambivalent if it wasn't something that they could immediately connect to seeing felt harm in their lives in the short-term future, or for their families and the people that they care about.
Thanks, Ash. Just quickly, Mark Howard's made a comment, doesn't Facebook recruitment exclude people? Well, yeah, it does exclude people who don't like using Facebook, yes, that's for sure. But you know, in our research, we're not we are interested in diversity and heterogeneity of participants. We don't go for, you know, representative samples of generalizability, and we make that very clear as well. You know, any kind of recruitment really is going to have its pros and cons and exclude some people. Doesn't matter what approach you use, but you just have to be very open about that and acknowledge that when you write about your methods. And just about data privacy, I was just thinking to myself, so I was completing the census yesterday online, I was wondering, it'd be interesting to know if the average Australian citizen who's been, you know, had so much negative publicity around government use of data, whether they've become more, I guess, tentative or about revealing the very private information, you know, your birth date, your address, your what you do for a job and so on in the census, which of course is vitally important for government statistics and planning, but whether people have become a little bit more wary about that in recent times, be interesting to know. Anyway, we will leave it at that because we do have to move on. As I mentioned early on, Claire Southerton unfortunately is feeling ill today and isn't able to give her talk. So we will move straight on to Ash again. If you're ready, Ash, to speak with Vaughan Wozniak O'Connor. Are you fine to get going?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Vaughan's going to kick us off, so I'll pass straight on to him.
Oh, great. So I'll just introduce you both. Ash, as I mentioned, is working as a postdoctoral fellow, and so is Vaughan, Wozniak O'Connor, both working with Jackie Leach Scully and myself at the UNSW node of the AIC Centre of Excellence for ADM and Society. And Ash and Vaughan are both working together in the health focus area with projects related to ADM and emerging technologies in health specifically. Thanks, Vaughan.
Thanks, Deborah. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, just beginning just by acknowledging the Gadigal and Gadigal people, the traditional custodians on the land which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Just before we start, grab yourself a pen and a scrap of paper, because we're going to do a bit of a talk about methods and then actually do a little quick method as well. So just grab one of those if you can. So thanks to Deborah for the intro. My name is Vaughan Wozniak O'Connor, and I'm collaborating with Ash and Deborah as well, alongside our colleagues Jackie Leach Scully and Georgia Van Torn at UNSW node of ADM+S. So as you can kind of see in this, you get a bit of a taste of some of our backgrounds and I guess how that informs our methodological approach as well. The kind of mix of the more ethnographic and maybe like design research-based methods, and how we kind of bring that sensibility to examine automated decision-making in the context of the health focus area. So this is really the kind of first cab off the ranks for us. And I'll try and keep this really short and snappy, this little talk. So the first project that Ash and I are working on is automated decision-making and AI in Australian health startups. So this is really work in progress for us. I think we're starting some of the more observational work on Thursday, so it's really pretty fresh and pretty new. So yeah, we're really looking at how emerging health tech startups and how they understand and kind of delineate between automated decision-making, AI, and other kind of forms of frontier technologies in this space. So specifically, we're looking at the Health 10X Accelerator program, which is delivered by the George Institute and UNSW founders through the MCIC. So in Health 10X, startups receive entrepreneurship education, business development, as well as seed funding with the hope of standing up new and innovative health startups. Their cohort kind of comes from across Australia, and it's been running over a series of years. So in terms of the research questions we're interested in looking at, this is kind of what's guiding our approach, and it's not so much focused on like the specific code or kind of applications, but broader questions in terms of what's out there, how people are kind of delineating or defining ADM or AI, how they kind of, what they see is some of the blockages, benefits, limitations of these technologies, but also how they kind of imagine and communicate ADM and AI within health and in kind of a broader emerging startup context. So if you just even at face value, straight off the bat, looking at past participants in this program, you kind of start to get a sense of what drew us into this program as well, in terms of the way that health tech startups, the particular imagery that they use to try and communicate technologies that are, you know, like I think when we're talking about AI and ADM, they're essentially non-sensory, non-visual technologies in many instances. So how do you communicate something like that to a general audience? And so I think the imagery and the kind of imaginaries that people employ to try and communicate these these services and products to a general audience is quite interesting. And we kind of even just see this in like the branding approaches of these groups. So from here, what we're really interested in is kind of this question of imaginaries as well, particularly through our kind of methodological interventions, considering how metaphors might be used by startups to kind of imagine these technologies differently, or kind of communicate them in alternative ways. So how the language and imagery used can work to both obscure or reimagine emerging technologies, like machine learning, AI, ADM. So we're drawing on the work of like probe-based work, such as Dan Lockton's Imaginaries Lab and the new Metaphors kit. Yeah, just as a kind of a way of thinking about forcing metaphors and thinking about ways that technologies like ADM and AI and machine learning and all of these things might be communicated outside of the more like traditional sci-fi infused imagery of like meshes and circuit boards and like circuit board brains and holograms and things that are largely speculative and not really necessarily related to the way that these technologies function. So just in terms of our kind of like our flow in terms of the overall method and what that looks like. So we're kind of starting out with, it's definitely transitioned from what was initially a kind of a mixed online, offline approach to a very much, due to current circumstances, Zoom-based mode of conducting observation as well as workshops. So we're kind of kicking off with observation of the 10x Accelerator programs on Zoom, doing a bit more kind of written work to take notes on what was discussed, but also kind of reflect a bit more deeply on the kind of what was discussed in relation to the broader thematic interests of the project. From there, we kind of go into a workshop, thinking again, working a bit more deeply into how participants define and imagine ADM, and then kind of working as part of the workshop, providing a probe-based activity, giving prompts to participants, as well as altered cards from the new Metaphors kit. So part of the workshop, we're looking at what I've found to be quite useful for online facilitation, just using things like Jamboard for collaborative mind mapping. So just kind of as a really visual way of scaffolding a workshop, so people can kind of progress through it and kind of collaborate as part of the discussion. And so yeah, this was just the idea of like more traditional pre-COVID activity pack probe kits to send out, which has obviously had to change. To kind of more like trying to think about how giving prompts to people potentially via email, but also trying to get something of that like very handmade creative responses, that sort of like textual response back from participants as well. And so yeah, these are some of the kind of the prompts that we're looking to provide to participants. And so yeah, the Lockton Imaginary Labs kit's really great in terms of it having already some really useful prompts that are specifically related to this context as well. And so it really works just by having these kind of two different cards that you kind of are forced to draw comparative characteristics between these things, which I think is really useful for thinking about developing new ways of imagining or kind of communicating something like ADM and AI. So we'll throw it over to Ash.
Thanks, Vaughan. So yeah, as Vaughan overviewed in the activity prompts, so these follow a workshop and people take them home and have a number of weeks to complete 4 questions. And we encourage people to write in response, to draw in response, to collage, As well as questions, we provide them with some blank cards to do their responses on, and a set of images and a word list that they can take inspiration from or remix however they like. Some of those images are kind of those typical images that Vaughan talked about, and others are random, like a shovel, trees, fish in the ocean. As Vaughan said, to draw on how Dan Lupton uses those imaginaries cards. So I'd like everybody to try the fourth prompt in the pack. The first three are about where people work, who people work with, and what is important for people in their communicating their startup, and then how they use ADM and AI in that. This is the fourth prompt. So it's around the idea of the black box and the explainability problem. And the key question is, how would you describe artificial intelligence to a general audience? I'd like to ask everybody to have a stab at this right now. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, probably about 3 minutes to work on it. And then we'll talk about kind of why we're interested in this approach to this question. I'll put my timer on and I will just sing out when we're done.
Just bearing in mind we've got 4.5 minutes left, Ash.
Yeah, I got my timer on. All right, we will leave it there at 2.5 minutes. In the spirit of audience participation, can I ask people to share in the chat what they came up with as a first impression about how they might explain AI to a general audience? Something that we, I suppose, trying to do with this activity included in the probe pack is to explore a bit how health tech startup groups at a really critical time in their development are dealing with the hurdle of trust and what they draw on in the first instance, not to explain the kind of the technical function of AI, while that's central to it, but also what they focus in on in the social value and communicating the social value of this technology and what it can do. Vaughan, can I get you to jump to the next slide for me? Yeah. So I'll just leave this up to, okay, 1 minute, great. So there's a couple of great uses of cultural probes in sociology before. One is Deborah and Michael, who used it to probe public's understandings of big data. And something that we like about this is locating these very tricky things in startup workers' everyday lives and practices. So a lot of people kind of in building their narrative in order to go public and try and seek funders, craft these very personal, emotional stories about why they've gotten into this project and what the impact can be of what they've designed and why to people personally and in a broader social sense. And in analysing it, on the next slide, please, Vaughan. Shanti Robertson is another sociologist who's used the cultural probes approach. And in her article, she's reflected on analysing the materials that are generated in them. And she talks about it as slippery data, something that we kind of want to approach in a very particular way because it's multimodal and because it's speculative and draws on imaginaries, that it's not something that we kind of want to approach in a typical qualitative analytic frameworks, and we don't want to kind of over rationalize what people craft as a response, but almost use it in order to open up the directions and simulate new questions that we can then build on in another phase of research. Thank you. Some great things coming in the chat, which is great to see. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. We'll leave it there and open to questions.
Great, thanks, Ash and Vaughan. Hope you all enjoyed experimenting with the method. Any questions for Ash and Vaughan? Maybe I think people are a bit distracted by reading everyone's responses.
Yes, well, so am I.
Yeah.
I like this, finding a path through a dense forest. These are great.
Yeah, it's interesting to see such sort of natural world metaphors used, isn't it?
Yeah.
As opposed to techie metaphors.
Yeah, well, that's something that I suppose, I don't know if you wanted to talk on that, Vaughan, something that like we really love what Dan Lupton has done, and we really find value in drawing on the beyond the usual images and ideas that are presented, and we wanted to do that in workshops with people before they get the take-home activity pack.
Yeah, definitely. I think even just that thing of the natural aspect is really interesting in online culture more broadly. Like even the idea of like a site, a website being something that's kind of like a physical space as well. It's interesting the way that these kind of metaphors about technologies are so kind of pervasive as well. So yeah, I think it's just really kind of thinking about how we are kind of acknowledging that and then trying to think about Lupton's method as a way of kind of forcing different visual metaphors and trying to come up with alternative strategies for thinking about these technologies that are still kind of quite new in many ways. So yeah. Yeah, I'm loving these responses as well. They're so interesting.
Ruth, did you want to ask a question? You notice that your hand was up.
Sorry, just unmute. I've completely forgotten what it was.
Well, thanks for sharing.
Sorry. I remember now. I think you're asking about feedback and about that exercise, and just want to thank you for it, because these Zooms can just seem quite endless and exhausting. And I just found that very energizing and good to actually think. So, I think it's a great technique to use online. So thank you for that.
You. Oh, I'm very glad.
And I think also, what the exercise highlighted to me is it depends on our positionality, how we're going to respond to that. So, over the last few years, I've become really interested in kind of plain language and accessibility around explaining things and the dangers of idiom or imagery or metaphor. Well, not dangers, but that could be quite exclusive. So I was very concrete in my explanation. So it's really fascinating just seeing how other people kind of engage with it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And sorry for being such a dill brain when I joined.
Totally fine.
I think also what it shows though is how we are doing these methods online, because it's a similar process in that it's actually reflecting how we actually do it with participants in a similar way, and it can be a generative way to do these methods online. Whereas often we've tended to think, oh, you can only do it face to face, you know, and you can't get really good engagement. But we've been finding the opposite, and we've just all experienced that today, just taking part in this little exercise, I think, as well.
There was one more question in the chat. Deborah, do we have time to do one more?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Could you please elaborate on the methodological considerations? How did we arrive at specific probes? Yeah, I guess Vaughan and I have just done a lot of looking at what other people have done using creative approaches, like the talk that Deborah and I just spoke about, that other project. This is a similar kind of workshop and activity-based approach. So we have some experience in it, and I guess how we settled on these ones, hopefully you agree, Vaughan, we tried to keep it really quite simple, but also open-ended, and really zoom in on the key things that we wanted to know more about in terms of their actual practices and what people in startups are actually doing at this critical point in time. So the first 3 questions in the probes focus on kind of what spaces matter to them, what relationships matter to them in their work, and what kind of stories or metaphors or images are important to communicating their work. So I guess they were 3 really essential things that speak directly to our research questions that we wanted people to creatively reflect on and yeah, represent in a pen and paper based way that wasn't kind of giving the response in an interview situation. And then the black box one, I guess this is just one of the key things that's come up within the Centre of Excellence is the problem of explainability and how essential that is to so many things. Like I said about yeah, kind of public's trust and how we communicate value. And we thought it would be an interesting one, especially for a group of designers like this who are likely familiar, if they have a design background, with something like a cultural probe. So we thought actually we could just get some really cool and interesting data from a group by asking them a question like that.
Yeah, just to add on to that as well, like my background is in more the art and design approach. So definitely probes are a big thing in that context. So
yeah, and with the Vitalities Lab, we've experimenting for a couple of years now. We were able to hold a few methods workshops experimenting with this kind of probes, including Dan Lupton's new metaphors pack early on when I started at UNSW. So yeah, it's something we've been interested in for a while, just in our little research group there. So definitely something we're focusing on into the future with the Centre of Excellence as well. Thanks very much, Ash and Vaughan. I think we all had a lot of fun there from the sounds of it. So we make do with what we have at home at the moment. So let's get going. We've now got 3 talks from our colleagues at the Australian Centre for Health Engagement, Evidence and Values at the University of Wollongong, beginning with Eve St. James Aquino. So Eve, would you like to get going, please? And as usual, I'll put my timer on for the 14 minutes so that to give a 1-minute warning. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for giving me the opportunity to share my reflection on translating normative theory into empirical research practices, specifically in researching near futures for healthcare artificial intelligence. To let you know, I'm working in a project that is funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council Ideas Grant with investigators from University of Wollongong, University of Sydney, Macquarie University, University of Adelaide, Monash University, and St. Vincent's Breast Screen. And our team consists of public health experts, bioethicists, health economists, health lawyers, data scientists, and clinicians. And our project aims to focus on diagnosis and screening in breast cancer and cardiovascular disease. But I'm going to focus on the first part, which is the systematic analysis of perspectives of professional stakeholders on the ethical, legal, and social implications of using machine learning. Later, Stacey will speak about the other sections or the other phases of our study. So at the moment, artificial intelligence is mostly applied in image classification analysis to help clinicians read radiographic images and laboratory slides. In other areas, such as the Apple Watch. They are developing wearables with ECG. It has been approved by the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, but that's not been widely deployed in Australia. And given the supposed benefits of artificial intelligence, such as increasing accuracy and productivity of diagnosis, as well as speedier results, usually medical AI has raised a number of ethical issues as well. So there's the problem of explainability, or the black box issue that was discussed in the previous talk. There's also the problem of trying to analyze whether benefits outweigh harms or vice versa. There's the problem of algorithmic bias, where certain algorithms work in specific setting or with specific social groups, but not in others. There's also the problem of responsibility, especially when something goes wrong. If there's a misdiagnosis or error in diagnosis, who is going to be liable to that? At the moment, it really depends on the role of the algorithm, whether it's assisting clinicians, it's augmenting skills, or it will fully automate tasks. There's also the issue about privacy, because algorithms do rely a lot on data, and it does require access and data sharing more than ever. And those are the things that we wanted to explore in our study. And specifically for my part, I'm going to talk about the stakeholder interviews that I've done. And we have, again, this is a multi-method empirical and theoretical bioethics project. And we wanted to engage with professional stakeholders, patients and health service users, as well as the general public, about the ethical, legal, and social implications of implementing AI in healthcare, especially in screening for breast cancer and cardiovascular disease. So we recruited participants who know enough to be informative about the potential implications of AI in their field, but did not have to be AI specialists. We wanted to access both AI expertise and professional or clinical expertise. Initially, we recruited via general advertisements calling for expressions of interest by through organizational newsletters, as well as social media platforms such as Twitter. We directly approached people with relevant public profiles and then invited them directly to participate. We also used local conferences and announcements and tried to look for speakers who have relevant profile for our study. Over time, our sampling became more theoretically informed, and that means we targeted people who might help us address gaps in our analysis. The semi-structured interviews took between 20 minutes and 80 minutes and were done via Zoom or telephone. It covered issues including healthcare AI development in Australia compared to overseas, imagined futures for healthcare AI, how AI might or might not change things for clinicians and service users, as well as key ethical issues and how they should be addressed in practice or in regulation. Our analysis procedures included memo writing on each interview, coding the interview transcripts, organizing findings into a framework, and memo writing on each of the core concepts or themes in the analysis. I led the analysis in collaboration with Stacey Carter and feedback from our CI team. The image in the slide shows the framework matrix that develops in the course of the interviews. The vertical axis designates each informant, and the horizontal axis designates key concepts and themes. And these themes or key concepts can change in the course of the interview process. So far, our participants are quite varied in terms of expertise. We have clinicians who are radiologists, breast clinicians, cardiologists, oncologists, imaging specialists, emergency physicians, and GPs. We also have developers who are usually computer scientists, software engineers, health informaticians, and biostatisticians. And then entrepreneurs are those who are medical officers in medical technology or medical device companies or startup CEOs. We were also able to engage with regulatory experts. So these are policymakers, regulators, policy officers for organizations, as well as health lawyers and health technology assessment experts. Do note that most of our participants do have multiple expertise, which is very valuable for our purposes. So for today, I will share with you my experience in translating my training and expertise in normative ethics to empirical bioethics. A little bit of background: I have a medical degree. I'm a physician from in the Philippines. I do not have an Australian license, but I do have a medical background. After that, I was able to complete my master's and PhD in bioethics, specifically in bioethics and philosophy of medicine at Macquarie University. So my grounding is really from the philosophical tradition, and not as and I didn't have a lot of exposure to empirical methods during my time as a philosopher in training. And at the moment, I want to share my experience in managing to complement both normative and empirical dimensions of the ethical analysis of using artificial intelligence in diagnosis and screening. In terms of normative ethics, the discipline is really born out of philosophy and is one of the branches of ethics. As with most studies in philosophy, research in normative ethics tend to be tradition and philosopher-driven. So in ethics, you have key traditions that are defined by how they determine the standards of what is right and what is wrong. So you have one tradition that states consequences of the action is the basis of ethics, and utilitarianism is a specific type of consequence-based ethics. So the phrase "the greatest good for the greatest number" is usually associated with this tradition. And another tradition is deontological ethics. It argues that it is not the consequences of actions, but a set of rules and duties that define what is right or wrong. So you also have other traditions such as virtue ethics. What I mean by philosopher-driven reasoning is that a lot of times when we do research and analysis in philosophy, you usually go back to the primary philosophers of that tradition. So you have in utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill. In the ontological tradition, you have Immanuel Kant. And what happens when we do analyze bioethical problem, we try to identify appropriate traditions or schools of thought. As a philosophy student, you tend to be indoctrinated into one of these ethical traditions. So usually they feel like it's a religion and you have to be loyal at some point. And then we try to analyze relevant concepts in the problem. We try to identify relevant arguments according to each tradition. And we try to analyze primary texts. So those are the texts by the key authors, key thinkers, or key philosophers, as well as secondary texts. So the analysis of the primary text. And then we try to apply those arguments to the bioethical problems, such as the ethics of medical AI. What is really interesting about the normative ethics, I think less so now, is the philosophical dogma referred to as the naturalistic fallacy. It states that it is wrong to think that moral or normative statements, that means what ought to be, can be derived from factual statements or what is. So the implication here is that philosophers tend to distrust or are disinterested in empirical methods that describe phenomena. According to philosophers, the moral truth needs to be purely an intellectual pursuit, and what exists in the world has the potential to add impurities to the intellectual analysis. The dogma also implies hard borders between disciplines or expertise, and there is an implied superiority of philosophical text and philosophical interpretation over other types of interpretation and analysis. Overall, intellectual analysis prioritizes the search for ultimate moral truth. And this is where I believe empirical methods from the social sciences can offer an advantage. And I do understand that the audience consists of social scientists and researchers who use empirical methods. So I'm not going to talk about these the aspects of empirical methods. But what I want to emphasize is the idea of having a study design methods of data collection and analysis is something new to me. I was initially apprehensive, but with the guidance of Stacy and our research team, I was able to learn empirical methods while keeping the strengths of the normative approach. So here I want to share with you a specific example of how I approach interviews by using normative tools that I'm used to as a philosopher. So in philosophy, if you have a research study you want to explore, you tend to examine and challenge numerous philosophical claims in at least two ways. So you have the backward analysis, by looking at the underpinnings of the claim. So those are the box on the left of the claim. These are the underlying assumptions, definitions of terms in the claim, as well as background knowledge. So what is known historically and what is currently known about the claim. The second is the more forwarding kind of analysis, where you want to look at the implications of the claim. So you want to examine the logical extension or conclusion of the claim. You want to look at the practical and the normative implications as well. When we talk about practical implications, these refer to consequences of the claim given a specific real-world context. You also want to look at normative implications, which refer to rules, standards, or prescriptions, or even policies that arise from the claim. In an interview study, we can translate the philosophical claim into an informant's claim. And then you just translate the left box and the right box. And as you are doing the interview, you need to be aware of the underpinnings, the box on the left, and the implications, or the box on the right. So a specific example in our study of the ethics of medical AI is a common claim that we get. It's that medicine can benefit from AI because AI is more objective. So given that statement, what does the informant mean when they say objective? What evidence is there to demonstrate the objectivity? What about bias reported in the media, where some AI work for specific groups, but not for others? So usually you'll get very interesting definitions of objectivity. A lot of informants don't even know that they're defining objectivity. For example, some informants would say something is objective if it involves statistics. And then, of course, the idea of a circular definition might come up. Some people actually say that objectivity is less human intervention. So the less human involvement there is, the more objective something is. So that also invites further exploration. After the underpinning prompting, we also want to know the implications of the statement. When the informant said more objective, what do they mean more objective? More objective than whom? So usually they might say more objective than human beings. Other implications would be, does that mean AI is better than human beings? And you want to push it further to say, is it fair that based on that claim, that down the line, AI should replace humans? So that will help you, that will actually invite further examination from the informant. This approach reveals a lot and invites the informant to examine and actually articulate some assumptions that you would otherwise not get if you take their word for it. So in terms of summary, key reflections about the complementary approach highlights the need to identify strengths and limitations of analytic tools and empirical methods, and also the need to highlight the tendency of descriptive claims to also have normative underpinnings and implications. I also want to highlight the value of stakeholder interviews. Medical AI or automated decision-making in healthcare is inherently a multi- or interdisciplinary venture. Interviews with different experts can reveal underlying assumptions about the nature of medicine, how we view technology versus how we view humans, and general views that may inform the way we embrace or reject emerging technologies. The interviews also reveal competing goals and values that inform how AI is developed, implemented, and regulated. And with that, I thank you, and I hope I shared something insightful about a philosopher doing empirical research in medical AI. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Eve. I really enjoyed your characterization of normative kind of masculinist, disembodied philosophy, because that's something that's frustrated me a lot about bioethics in particular. I've actually written a piece on more than human approaches to bioethics and digital health, if anyone's interested in that. And what I was thinking about too is, Eve, is given that you, as you said, you have medical training as a medical practitioner, and then you went into the sort of this disembodied rationalist bioethical philosophy, I'm wondering whether you ever, I'm sure you did, but I mean, maybe to reflect on, you would have been in there amongst the bodies as a practitioner, amongst the feelings and thoughts and kind of visceralities of fleshly bodies, and then you went and engaged with the very disembodied traditional normative philosophy. And I'm wondering if that those two quite different experiences is what led you to this reflections today?
Yeah, oh, definitely. It's really interesting doing that other way of transitioning. So from medicine to philosophy, and philosophy of medicine in particular. So in philosophy of medicine, you have very abstract and conceptual debates of the definition of disease, for example. And I remember encountering a philosopher who said disease is defined by pathologists. So, in practice, that's not necessarily the case. And there is really no sort of universal definition of disease because a lot of specialists don't care about universalizability and generalizability. They're interested about diagnosis that will help them as a professional and that will help their patients. So they don't care about this overarching definition that philosophers might care about. So there you see the tension of what is called for in practice, but what philosophers are interested in. And you kind of feel like you're being pulled from two directions, but then you do have to commit to something in order to finish your PhD project. So yeah, so I did have to go to the abstract route at some point, but the tension was there definitely.
Yes, and it clearly has led you back into wanting to stakeholders, which is fantastic. We have a question from Mark Howard. He says, Eve, wonderful to see the philosophers represented. In my research, I'm finding that a feminist ethics of care is helpful in discussing the potential implications of AI in medicine. Have you considered this?
Definitely. It's something that Stacey and I are talking about, especially in the context of algorithmic bias. So I think that's where the area of intersectionality, not just about gender, but about racial disparities in healthcare that are being replicated, if not worsened, by automation. Not just artificial intelligence, but any kind of automation. So definitely, and also the ethics of care can have sort of a contribution because it highlights what are the competing values about medicine. So some informants view medicine as a more performance or outcome-based. No matter how you do it, for as long as you can assure accuracy, speed of results, then it's fine. But others say there's more to it in medicine than any other industry, and that's the aspect of empathy, personal communication, especially if you're talking about really difficult decisions and diagnosis, such as cancer. You don't want an automated thing to deliver the message to you. So a lot of informants say that medicine is quite special in that sense. It requires us to acknowledge the aspect of care that is quite humanistic. But thank you so much, Mark.
And Jackie's got a comment. Jackie, do you want to repeat your comment that you've put in the chat?
Yeah, okay. I just said that I think feminist bioethics also tends to be a bit more aware of the body and embodiment as a core ethical issue. So I just added, I think that's particularly, there's particular tension there. Part of the appeal, I'm guessing, of AI and ADM and similar technological things is that it's appealing because it's nice and shiny and clean, and there's no, what I've said was that there's no messy bodies or gloopy stuff involved. Yeah. And we know that people and societies aren't really like that.
I was going to say, and that's something that we encounter in our interviews as well, the tension between what is mechanistic and automated in the form of artificial intelligence, and then what goes on in human clinicians and embodied clinicians. Because clinicians sort of react to their patients as well, and every patient can result in different reaction. Whereas if you're going for AI and automation, you're looking for standardization. You're looking for sort of rigid norms that you want to be able to replicate for every clinical interaction. But in the real world, that's not necessarily the case. So thank you so much, Jackie.
Yes, and as we know, many AI-led diagnoses software has actually not tended to live up to their promises. But thank you, Eve. We've run out of time, but thank you very much. Really thought-provoking. And we'll move on to the next person, who's Annette Brannock-Meyer. Have you got yourself sorted for your screen sharing, Annette? Aha.
You can see it, Annette.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Annette. So Annette is also from the Australian Centre for Health Engagement, Evidence and Values at the University of Wollongong. You've also got a mouthful, haven't you, in the title of your centre? Have you got some snappy acronym that you use for your centre, or?
Achieve.
Achieve. Very good. That's fantastic. We'll have to come up with one for ours. Okay. Thank you very much, Annette. Go for it. Thank you.
You're on mute, Annette.
Mute. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes. Right. Good.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing with a range of colleagues, with a big list of people at the end, on community attitudes towards sharing people's health data derived from public sources primarily with the private sector for research and development. So, a little bit of background. There's been a lot of pressure in the last decade or so to increase the use of the large public sector databases that we have in Australia to support a range of activities in the private and public sectors. And that's come from a very wide array of sources, but there was a quite influential report from the Productivity Commission about 3-4 years ago now, which pushed a number of public agencies into having to engage with this space. So as a result of that, we did some work with the Population Health Research Network, and then also got the opportunity to work with Health Consumers New South Wales to look at the question of what are community attitudes towards the use of people's linked administrative data by the private sector for therapeutic development, taking into account that we know that there is a great deal of community concern about privacy, secondary uses that people do not share, and lack of understanding of what the possibilities are. So really quickly, for an audience that I suspect does know a great deal about data linkage, what is it? It's a way of bringing together information about the same person from separate sources. And those sources can be things like births, deaths and marriages data, my health records through Medicare or going to hospital. It might be my education records, but it can also be interactions with the justice system, housing data, Centrelink data. Done well, best practice data linkage keeps identifying information about people restricted and quite separated from the other information sources and brings them together, and then provides the opportunity to analyse combined data sets, sometimes for the whole Australian population. Why might the private sector be interested in this? Well, I'll give you 2 examples. You might be a pharmaceutical company that wants to bring your new oncology drug to the Australian market from your international site, and to support your case for listing on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, you not only want to have your clinical trials data, but you want some registry data from our cancer registries, and you want to link those together. Or you might be a medical device company who's made a fantastic new implant, and after that's been listed by the TGA as safe, you want to follow it to do some post-marketing surveillance, and you might want records as diverse as surgical data, hospital emergency admissions, pharmaceutical benefits data, even general practice data. And that all contributes to you being able to analyse how safe your device is in an ongoing way. So how do you go about researching people's views about data linkage? If you look at your average public-facing website about data linkage, and this comes from one of the national data linkage units, you find very quickly an array of words and phrases that are actually not at all straightforward. Explaining how privacy is protected in best practice data linkage is actually quite complex. And so when we were tasked with looking at community attitudes, we gave some thought to what are the range of ways in which you might be able to get people to comment on views about data linkage using their personal data by the private sector, but taking into account that they're unlikely to understand the mechanism of data linkage. So we did 2 things. One of these is not at all innovative, but I'm using it because it's, I think, quite a nice examples were put alongside the citizens' juries, and I'll come back to that at the end when I show you why. So we ran a national survey and then 2 citizens' juries. The national survey, with our not so innovative methods, we ran in the middle of 2019. We used McNair Yellow Squares, which is a marketing company with a very large online panel, and surveyed just over 2,500 people. We gave them a very brief introduction in this about 10-minute survey to what data linkage is, what health data are, how the private sector is involved, and what happens in de-identification, but obviously not much. So amongst the many things that we asked people about in that 10 minutes, we asked them for their agreement or otherwise with 3 purposes of using their health data, of a use of their health data by the private sector. One about improving health services, one about making new medical devices, and the third one for research. And as you can see from the graph, we've got between 50 and 60% of the population from that survey sample broadly in agreement with that use of their health information once it's been de-identified. We also asked them about their consent preferences, and just over half of that sample said that they wanted to be able to opt in for their health data to be used, and the other groups were fairly evenly divided between the opt-out, I don't need to know, just use it, and don't use it at all. So then, just before COVID, like by a whisker, we managed to run 2 juries in Parramatta and in Wollongong last year. Again, recruited through a social marketing company. This time we used Stable Research from their online panel. They stratified that for us by age, gender, education, household income, employment status, and they actually did cultural diversity as well, even though we didn't ask. We had a facilitator who had a health consumer community engagement background, and we paid our jurors $400 plus expenses. And the charge that we gave them in the 2 juries was, under what circumstances is it permissible for governments to share health data with private industry for research and development? So the process was we sent people out a large information booklet about a week before. We told them they could look at it, but they didn't have to. That information booklet had material that we then covered in information sessions. So it was there also for a resource for them during the jury. We had so the jury ran over 2.5 days with a dinner on the first night, which had a very small amount of information about the content of the jury and the process, but was really designed as a get-to-know-you exercise. The information sessions that we ran on the Saturday were short, sharp, 10-minute in-person presentations from that across that array of topic areas, and then a question and answer format at the end of that. We also had 4 advocacy groups represented who came along to give their perspective on whether it was acceptable and under what circumstances it would be acceptable to share public data with the private sector. So the Saturday was our information providing Q&A, data information sharing day. The advocacy groups we ran as a World Cafe with small groups of our jurors moving between them for an hour and a half or so. And we had lots of check-ins through the day, including our facilitator asking, what else do you need to know? And because we by and large had a reasonably large group of experts sitting outside of the deliberative process, we were able to provide some of that answer on the spot. The Sunday was a fully deliberative day, combination of small and large group work, and then the development of the recommendations were led by the participants. They formulated them in small groups, refined them in big groups, and then we voted, and then they voted on them. So really quickly, what did they tell us? We had, well, first of all, 20 jurors in Illawarra, 19 from Western Sydney. We had someone drop out on the morning of the Saturday because they were unwell. In Wollongong, all the jurors supported sharing data with private industry for research and development, and they had 19 recommendations. In Parramatta, all but one supported sharing, and there were 14 recommendations or conditions. So these are the kinds of recommendations the two juries came up with, quite independently of each other. They were actually very, very similar, and dealt with matters like the need for data to always be de-identified. Both groups set up or said we needed an independent stakeholder oversight panel. The Wollongong jury said that uses that were related to public good were going to be acceptable. The Parramatta jury were broader and said anything to do with research and development. They wanted penalties in place for private sector organisations who used data either inappropriately or not in line with what they said they were going to do. They thought people should pay for data, and the Wollongong jury wanted that money going back into the health system. The Wollongong jury were divided in their views on what kind of a consent mechanism to have between waivers and opt-outs. And the Parramatta jury actually did not make recommendations about it because they took for granted that there would be a consent waiver. So there were no recommendations there. We had the opportunity, and we took the opportunity, to ask our jurors before they started the jury, and then again just after they finished, exactly the same questions that we'd asked in the national survey. And so you remember I said to you before that when we asked people about the extent of their agreement with sharing data with the private sector for those three purposes, we had between 50 and 60%. The jurors before they started the jury were between 68 and 79%, and we think probably partly that reflects some of them having read the booklet before the jury. After the jury, they were all sitting above 90%. We did the same thing with the consent questions. Before the jury, the jurors were reasonably similar to our national sample, although there was a slightly higher proportion who were in favour of an opt-in consent mode. At the end of the jury, they were about equally divided between an opt-in approach, an opt-out approach, and to just use the data. There were no people left who weren't sure, and there was no one saying that there was that very tiny group about not using information at all. So, thinking about what does this tell us, and reflecting on the methods that we used, I think the first thing is we had hints from the survey because we had an open-ended question at the end where we gave people an opportunity to write whatever they thought, that people's understandings of, for example, what role a pharmaceutical company might have were not as we necessarily thought they would think. So many people, and it was confirmed as the jury began, many of our jurors thought pharmaceutical companies market drugs. They don't make them. So the idea that there would be a role for the pharmaceutical sector in using public data for any purpose was something that they came to understand as the jury went on. I think the second point is because we had the opportunity to ask people immediately at the end of the jury about what they personally thought, as opposed to the recommendation that the jury made as a group, we could see the difference between the consensus-oriented approach, and I think Jackie referred to this at the beginning, which actually pushes people towards arriving at agreement together and to coming to a shared view, and in our case, I think pushed people towards saying opt-out or waiver of consent approaches, broad agreement with the private sector having access to public data are going to be acceptable. And once they had the opportunity privately to reflect on that, then we got something of a shift back towards the view that you might have amongst a group of people who were not as informed. Almost done. The final point is, I think, actually a point that is, again, along the lines of the point that Jackie was making at the beginning about the way in which deliberative approaches can engage with state actors. We we had very close involvement from a number of the agencies who collect and use these sorts of data. And what had struck me was that they came away from it utterly committed to deliberative approaches. And it was really those slides about the way in which people changed their views that seemed to be so compelling for them. That's got its problems, I think, but I think it's an interesting observation. So finally, to say thank you to the quite large and a wide array of people who've been involved in these processes over the last couple of years. And I think that's it for me, and I can stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Annette. Thanks for that. Has anyone got a question for Annette? I actually do have one, if no one else has one for now. So I might jump in. So, Annette, I'm interested in, given that it's about, as I understand it, the citizen juries are about kind of reaching a consensus as a group after much deliberation. What are the kind of policy implications of that? And particularly, I mean, I presume this is one reason you want to do this kind of research is to sort of inform policy development.
Yeah.
So what's the link between doing these juries and having your findings and then being able to affect policy with your findings? How do you go then?
So we've fed the jury findings into the public consultation process that's been going on around the new data sharing legislation. I would say, if I'm being honest, I would like to gild the lily and say we've made a difference. I don't think so. But what is interesting is that when we met with the then acting National Data Commissioner, what that group and he said was that this fitted quite well with the way in which the legislation was progressing. So I don't know what would have happened had we provided them with findings which looked really different. But there was actually a reasonable fit. So things around the legislation is in draft form at the moment. So to give you one example, they've got a set of components of the legislation about trusted actors and identifying trusted actors who are almost certified and then able to make use of data, and there's an independent body who would be doing that certification. So they were really interested when they got us to talk about how did your jurors come up with their independent oversight panels, and who did they want on their oversight panels, and what would they be doing, and over what kind of time frame. So I think there can be a link. You really need them at the table when you're doing the work for it to work well. And I know Stacey can talk about that as well. That's, I think, when it's at its most, where the potential for shaping policy is greatest.
Oh, right. Great. Thank you. So we've got time for one more question. Steph Slack has put her hand up. Steph, did you want to say your question, please?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry, my camera isn't working. I thought that was really interesting, Anna. I guess I just really had one comment and then one question. It was interesting listening to your findings based on some similar stuff's been happening in the UK with the sharing of GP data on the NHS more broadly.
Yes.
Purposes, etc. So I was just interested to hear the findings from the citizens jury versus what's happened in the UK, where they've now had to pull back their plan to introduce the data sharing initiative because of people's kind of reactions to being worried about what's going to happen to their data. And then I guess my question was around how much detail the juries went into around some of the implications of the recommendation. So things like ensuring that data is de-identified is a valid concern, but there are all sorts of issues with that in practice and of people being able to re-identify data. And then things like opting in through informed consent, or how high is the threshold for people to actually understand how the data is being used, etc.
Yeah. So I'll tackle your second comments and then come back to the first one about the GP data sharing area. the jurors in both juries absolutely understood that de-identification is not guaranteed and that it's probably a myth, because they kept being told that. They were, I think, actually doing a bit of a risk-benefit analysis about how good is good enough and under what circumstances. So they also had, I think, quite a good understanding of the difficulties or the challenges from the practical challenges that requiring opt-in consent can create if you are wanting that sort of an approach and intending to have a use of, say, hospital records. So there was quite a bit of talk about why, and in fact, the reason the Parramatta jury, as a jury, did not go down that road is because they just put it in the, well, of course we can't have consent because you just can't do this. There was still, however, quite a lot of conversation about, well, what does it mean for me as an individual? So I think they wrestled with it. On balance, came up with a view that provided that there were adequate controls in place and that it was very well monitored in an ongoing way, that there were good things to be done with through the private sector having access to public data.
Yeah.
General practice data. We're about to start some work around general practice data, and I think the issues there are actually even more complicated because general practice relationships are much more personal. And and so the data that is recorded about people in general practice records include a whole lot of things that people don't routinely share with other health providers. And they also include things about other people. So I will go to the GP and talk about my mother or my children. And I'll talk about things, say, at my work that might be relevant to my health status that are not collected in other health records about me. So I think the issues there are rather more complicated, and partly it's the relational nature of general practice. It's in best practice environments, the continuity of care in general practice that makes that an even more tricky situation. And I've followed the UK debate and I absolutely understand the pullback. The other odd thing, of course, in Australia is that general practitioners in Australia are the private sector. They're not a national health service. So the situation here has some quite complex legislative issues to be managed as well. So it will be different there as well.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Thanks, Annette, and thanks for your talk. Thanks very much. And now we'll move on to Stacey, who's our last speaker for today.
You're welcome.
Oh, whoops. Siri's decided I was talking to Siri just then. Maybe it sounded a bit similar to Stacey. Anyway, so thank you. Yeah, here we go. We can see your screen. Thanks very much, Stacey, also from the Achieve group. And yes, please start, Stacey. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Deborah, for organising such a fantastic morning. So this final presentation is about a project we've been doing, engaging women in discussions about the ethical and social implications of using AI in breast screening. So I want to tell you a bit about the background and then mostly focus on how we decided to design the study, just with acknowledgements to Eve and Lucy and Julie, who've been integral in running this part of the Torsen project. And this is part of the big NHMRC project that Eve spoke of earlier. So all of those investigators are also implicated here. So to give you a bit of background, many of you will know that screening mammography is both public and private in Australia, that in the public system, women 50 to 74 years of age are invited every 2 years to participate in mammography. It's a highly complex, highly contested program. There's a lot of investments. There's a lot of commitment to the program. There's a lot of questions around the evidence and the actual consequences of the program. So wading into mammography as an area of research is actually something that needs to be done with quite a great deal of care. It's also one of the earliest areas, as many of you will know, for development of machine learning. So as I'm sure many of us know, machine learning is particularly good at working with image data. And because breast screening programs have existed for so long, there are a lot of breast screening images available in many jurisdictions. So some of the earliest machine learning development has been around the processing and interpretation of these images. So there's 18 algorithms approved for use by the FDA already. For example, there's been a number developed in the UK, and one of them is this MIA algorithm developed by Chiron, which has just recently been approved for use for independent mammography reading in Australia. So this is the first instance of an algorithm being approved for use in Australia. The developers are super keen to get AI into breast screening in Australia. It hasn't happened yet, but they're really knocking the door down of the breast screening services. And the breast screening services are super keen to use machine learning because they can't get enough expert radiologists to read mammograms. And this creates delays in the system. It's difficult for them to staff their systems. And so the idea of having an independent AI that can read mammograms to a high level of accuracy is very attractive to them. So this is a kind of supercharged health machine learning problem to try and engage with consumers about. So in designing the study, we wanted to engage with women of screening age who would be directly affected. We knew that women probably wouldn't know much about what AI was or how it worked, and potentially wouldn't know that much about breast screening other than the direct experience of breast screening. And one of the really important things here is that the AI part, the screen reading part, all kind of happens behind the scenes. So if you're a breast screening user, a participant in breast screening, you don't necessarily have any direct interaction with the part of the process that AI will be implemented in. We wanted to, like many of the presentations today, we wanted to elicit women's values and their moral intuitions and judgments. So we wanted to know what mattered to them. We wanted to know what they thought should happen. We wanted to be really alert to that contestation that I've already referred to, but also because this is such a contested area, and because machine learning for AI is really in the very near horizon, so the algorithms already exist. It's really about which algorithms and how will they be implemented in breast screening. We wanted to embrace that constraint of thinking about what was really feasible in policy and practice, and potentially doing some work that could directly influence the way that machine learning might be implemented. So I've looked at lots of possible and been really inspired by lots of possible ways of doing this. So I looked at some of the design-based speculative approaches. I looked at some of the policy-related approaches that involve developing scenarios, and I also spent a bit of time in, some of you might know Pascal Lahou's work in the Infieri program in Montreal. They kind of developed imaginary technologies and got people to deliberate about them online. And all of these added something to our thinking about what we would do, but none of them were quite right for the situation that we were in, because we were working with a technology that already existed. We were working in a context where the participants didn't have a lot of content knowledge, and we didn't really have an object to work with. It was about a service that happened in the back room that people couldn't actually see. So we decided to design something from the ground up. We started by deciding that we wanted to work with groups. So we wanted women to feel supported. We also wanted to give them an opportunity to challenge one another's ideas. And we had to do it online because of COVID. So we used a market research company. We recruited very diverse groups, making sure that we had women from all ages, and that we had location variation, and that we had variation in women's social and economic background. We ran the groups with about 5 to 7 women in each group, with about 50 women in total involved in 8 groups. And to design the groups, we had the great resource of Eve's stakeholder interviews, which he had already done. So we did some analysis in those interviews, and we looked at the likely scenarios that have been predicted by the informants in those interviews, and we also looked at the normative judgments that those stakeholders were making, and that informed our first draft. Then we took that first draft to a wide range of the expert stakeholders that would be likely to be involved in implementing machine learning in breast screening. So we engaged with the screening programs themselves, with cancer organisations, and really importantly with the government actors who are in charge here. So the people who are going to be implementing machine learning within the federal government, which is responsible for screening programs in Australia, and that produced our second draft. And then we tested that for flow and comprehensibility, and that created our final draft. So this is what it looked like. This is what we ended up with. So the dialogue groups are, we called them dialogue groups, and they began actually with the idea of the methodology that Jackie presented earlier, because we had done some work with Jackie around these, but we ended up tweaking it a little, as you'll see. So we developed a pre-group protocol that we've been working on developing across the pandemic, actually. So we decided to mail hard copy activities, which some people have already talked about today. And we also had a researcher engagement with each participant before the group. And that engagement involved recording consent, but also explaining the process, getting people to do a pre-group survey, and also testing the platform that they would be using, so that when they came into the group, they would feel really confident to participate. We designed a 2-hour conversation. We made sure that there were 3 researchers present at each group, and that was very intentional. We knew that this cohort would have quite varied experience of working online, because not all of them were in the workforce, for example. And we wanted to make sure that we always had not just the moderator, but someone who could help with the tech if something went wrong, and also someone who could immediately leave the group without affecting the group, and engage in care work with individual participants if they needed it. So there was always someone to call a mobile phone number, to talk to people if they were upset, to help them if they were flustered, so that we knew that we had that support for participants. We designed an information sharing kind of module that took up about the first half hour of each group. So that involved a presentation with discussion and a video that helped women to understand the technology, but also to understand how breast screening works as a service, kind of the logic of it and how it's offered, and how the back end works. So how breast screenings, how mammograms are actually read at the moment, by whom and in what order. And then we organised a 4-part discussion. So the first part was to gather women's first reactions. And it was at this point that we introduced a person. We called her Catherine. So we asked women to imagine themselves 5 years into the future when artificial intelligence will probably be in use. And we asked them to imagine Catherine, who is a friend of yours, who has been invited to breast screen. It would be her 3rd routine screen, that she's received a consent form in the mail that says this breast screening service uses artificial intelligence to read mammograms. And Catherine calls you and asks what you think about this. What would you say to Catherine? So this was the first appearance of Catherine. And the use of the trope or the device Catherine, or women like Catherine, throughout the group did a few things. It helped us to narrativize and to relationally locate the discussions, so that women were able to talk about themselves, but also the other women in their lives, and to imagine slightly outside of their own experience. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to make a move that allowed women to talk beyond just their own personal values and preferences, so that they were trying to imagine women who would participate in breast screening more broadly. So after we had talked about that we worked through that first initial reactions exercise, then we had a structured values prioritization exercise, and this is where the mailed materials came in. So using the stakeholder interviews, but also our earlier reviews of the literature, especially the AI ethics literature as it relates to healthcare, we sent out in people's pre-mailed packs a list of the expected possible benefits and also ethical challenges around the use of AI in mammography. We also sent some dots. So women had this A4 sheet in front of them. They really liked having something physical to work with, and they had 2 green dots and 2 red dots. And we asked them to think back to Catherine and to imagine what they thought Catherine would care about the most and put 2 green dots on those 2 things, and what she would care about the least and put the 2 red dots on those 2 things. And we were using care about there as a kind of proxy for what women like Catherine would value. And then the main focus, although we did get people to discuss where they put their dots, obviously, but the main focus really was to get to the bottom of reasons. So why do you think people would care most about that? So someone like Catherine would care about that. Why do you think someone like Catherine would not care about that? So that gave us an opportunity to draw out what reasons seemed to mean the most to women, what really mattered the most. The next thing we tried to tackle was the most abstract, and to be honest, until we actually did the groups, I wasn't sure that this was going to be possible. We really wanted to try to have a direct conversation about explainability. And in my experience, even experts in AI are not very good at talking about explainability, but it was something that had been a real touchstone in a lot of our conversations with experts around medical AI, healthcare AI. And so we really wanted to bring that to women and to get their feedback about it. And again, the stakeholder interviews came into play here. So the way we decided to do it was that we created 2 A4 sheets that were different colours. And on those sheets from the stakeholder interviews and also from the literature, but especially from the stakeholder interviews, we presented the dominant arguments for and against healthcare AI being explainable, at least to clinicians. So we focused on explainability to doctors. And we asked women again to imagine Catherine that she's reading a magazine article that's presenting a for and against kind of debate piece about explainability of healthcare AI. And we asked women to discuss what did they think Catherine would think about this debate. So this was the sheet with the against explainability ideas, and this was the sheet around the for explainability ideas. Women were so across this task. They were incredibly forensic. So they almost to a group immediately asked, well, which doctor? And we had a long conversation about different levels of expertise and professional roles, and then how explainability might be relevant or not relevant to people in those different roles, and then how that might be important to women. And it was actually an incredibly detailed and really informative discussion. And then we finished with a kind of a wrap-up question. I'm sure many of you have used these sorts of questions that allowed women to draw out, and we brought this actually back to them, to their own personal views. Thanks, Deborah. We asked people just to draw out what they thought was most important in this area to see what they wanted to emphasise in closing. So just reflecting on these methods and how they went, the logistics I think really worked. Having 3 researchers was really helpful and actually came in handy several times. The pre-group engagement really worked. The mailed materials, and we've heard about that already today, women really loved having something physical to work with while they were online. The women were really engaged and interested for the whole 2-hour group. I wasn't sure whether that would work, but it did. So I'm really conscious that these methods were less imaginative than some of the speculative methods that we've heard about today, some of the methods from design and forecasting, which I would still love to use. But I really wanted this to be directly relevant and interpretable to breast screening services and responsive to that policy context. And what this allowed women to do is to bring the particularity of their own personal experience of breast screening, but also to draw in the detail of the technology that they'd learned about early in the interaction, and to bring those together to make sense of this kind of near horizon technology and how it might matter to them, and to develop their own normative positions. So I felt like we struck a good balance between trying to take our responsibilities as researchers in a really contested area quite seriously, but also really providing some scope for participants to push back and to work with the future possibilities that we were presenting to them. So thank you. That's it from me. I'll just get rid of this.
Right. Thanks very much, Stacey. And just to follow up on what you've just said, I find that when I use these methods with participants, they really, really enjoy them. They enjoy being creative and being engaged in something rather than just having questions fired at them, you know, Q&A type approach which still has its value, of course, you know, interviews and so on. But yeah, I'd often get a lot of really great feedback from participants. They do enjoy doing something a bit different. So it's interesting to hear that you found that as well. So any questions for Stacey? Oh, Jackie's got a hand up. Jackie?
Hi. Yes, as you might expect. Hi, Stacey. I thought that was absolutely fascinating and a really, really nice project. I've heard you talk about it a little bit, but not in that kind of detail. So fascinating. You mentioned at the start, basing some of it around the idea of dialogue groups and tweaking that idea a little bit. You kindly called it tweaking rather than improving. So I just wanted to ask you about one thing specifically there, because one of the things I'd emphasised when talking about the dialogue groups was the level of information giving. And I think I'd probably fixated on that because the groups that I was working with when I first started in that project I mentioned, from a fairly economically deprived part of the United Kingdom, and generally had not much education, not much involvement with official services and so on. And the difficulty we'd run into was providing a lot of information and watching them disengage. That the more we gave them, the more they disengaged because they felt very threatened. So I just wondered how you felt about how that worked, whether it was a different demographic for you or whether it's to do with the way in which you presented that information.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Jackie. So, so we deliberately made each group diverse within the group. So we had everything from people with quite high levels of education to high school or lower education in each group. We felt like for this particular technology, it was so far outside of people's experience. We felt like we really did have to provide a reasonable amount of information, or it would just be impossible almost to get the conversation off the ground in a way that connected to the possibilities. So the way we chose to do that was with the ubiquitous YouTube video. So we found a really short YouTube video, and Eve was super helpful with this, going through lots of possibilities, and we talked about everything that all the videos we could use, and ended up choosing one based partly on length, so it was only about 3 minutes long, engagement, but also balance, like trying to find something that wasn't stupidly hypey, that had a mixture of both the possible benefits and possible downsides, and also not suggesting that AI can do everything in breast screening right now. So that was a very engaging way to start, I think. And then we had a presentation which we deliberately tested quite a lot to make sure that it was really straightforward, very engageable, and we gave women lots of opportunities to ask questions. And actually we found people picked up quite a lot of the points that were raised in both the video and the presentation in the discussion. So throughout the discussions, and Eve's nodding, Eve actually moderated some and I moderated some, women would think back to that information and would kind of pull it out and use it in their deliberations. So I felt like it helped, and I felt like people benefited from having access to it, as though it increased the quality of the discussion. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Did I forget a second bit?
No, that's really interesting, and I'll have to think about whether it's just that I was incompetent in information provision at the outset, or whether it's something to do with more seriously to do with the different kinds of media that, like YouTube, which wasn't available at the time when we started out. So, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. So Margot Hoekstra has got a question. Was there any anxiety about false negatives? I might prefer a bias towards false positives, is her question.
Oh, that's such a great question. And I should disclose, I come to my interest in screening via a concern about overdiagnosis. So I'm often thinking counterintuitively about which harms matter most in screening programs. So we deliberately did 2 groups with women who'd had breast cancer and 6 groups with women who had not, to be roughly representative of the numbers in the population. And the conversation was maybe slightly different between those 2 groups. People weren't necessarily always very focused on the idea of either false negatives or false positives. They often would speak quite generally just about accuracy. But there was a really strong message that accuracy was the thing that mattered most. So that was very consistent. So across with that values prioritization exercise, 45 out of the 50 women put a green dot on accuracy. So, which is really interesting in the context of what AI can actually do at the moment, right? Like, because there's all these big hypey promises about how fantastic AI is and how good its performance is, but actually that's often measured in ways that advantages AI and uses relatively poor quality evidence. So I think it raised really important questions around what thresholds programs might set for the introduction of AI. Women also talked a lot about wanting quite a long implementation horizon, which is not consistent with what programs are thinking at the moment. They're wanting to just like get AI in there as quickly as possible. Women wanted quite a long testing horizon before implementation, and that was partly exactly as you suggest around mostly false negatives, actually. So people were mostly attentive to the idea of missed cancers, although occasionally people did also raise questions around not wanting to create a lot of false positives. My concern would actually be that the volume of false positives would go up significantly.
And I guess the elephant in the room, Stacey, is the whole wider debate about whether mass mammographic screening should even take place and at what age it should start if it does take place, which I assume you didn't even go into in this because you were focusing very, very specifically just on the value of AI. But I mean, I know you'd be aware of that whole big debate as well.
Yeah, and we've done work focusing on that kind of question before. So you're right. There was a part of there was always a part in the back of my mind that was thinking, why are we talking about the AI? We actually need to be talking about whether we should be doing this at all. Yeah. But I think because AI will definitely be implemented sometime soon, I think it's worth engaging with the women who will be the users of that service around how and under what conditions.
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, everyone. I think we've all got a really come away from this session, even though it has been completely online, sadly. But I get all the text worked fine. We've all managed to get our presentations going really well, so I'm really proud of everyone, including myself. But quite apart from that, the content's been fascinating. And it's been really great too, I think, to develop these connections that we have with your group at Achieve at the University of Wollongong and with our new Centre of Excellence, because we already have some connections to begin with, but it's been really great to build on those and to hear more about what you are doing. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing what we've been doing. And as I said, we've got a whole new session a week from now, five speakers beginning from 9:30 in the morning next Tuesday that you can sign up for if you haven't already. You can go back onto the ADM+S event website to sign up for that supposedly Melbourne-based program. Everyone will be in Melbourne, but we'll get to hear about their work online. And that does include a range of people, again, from both the health-related focus area of the Centre of Excellence, but also people working, sort of colleagues of some of ours at RMIT who are doing some really interesting creative methods in relation to health and emerging technologies. So thanks again to all the presenters today. I've really enjoyed hearing what everyone has to say. I've enjoyed having the discussion with the other participants joining us today in the audience, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day and maybe has a bit of time off Zoom or Teams for a while at least. And hope to see many of you again same time next Tuesday.